The bet was scrawled on a cocktail napkin in Lord Ashby's handwriting, and it read exactly like this. Whoever marries the plainest woman in this room before midnight gets Weston's country estate, 200 acres, and the satisfaction of watching the others choke on it. Every lord in White's Club laughed. Every lord signed it. And then the Duke of Blackwell, the most cold-blooded, most untouchable, most categorically uninterested in marriage man in all of England, looked across the crowded ballroom, let his gaze land on the one woman standing alone by the potted ferns, and said, "Done." Nobody laughed after that, because by 1147 she was his duchess, and by morning, every single one of them would have given every acre they owned to trade places with him. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she had been precisely reliably invisible for 26 years. Not ugly, that's important. She was not ugly. She had brown eyes that were interesting if you stopped long enough to look at them, flecked with something like amber, the kind of eyes that seemed to be thinking always, even when the rest of her face was politely still. She had dark hair she wore practically, because she'd never seen the point of suffering for an arrangement. She had ink permanently stained into the side of her right hand, which drove her mother absolutely wild. She was also, by any honest account, the most educated woman in any room she entered. She spoke 4 languages. She had read more law than most barristers. She'd spent 2 years in correspondence with a natural philosopher in Edinburgh who didn't know she was a woman until the 3rd year, at which point he'd apologized and then immediately asked her to keep writing, because she was the most interesting mind he'd corresponded with in a decade. None of this had ever once caused a man to ask her to dance. She was plain, her mother had told her since childhood, not cruelly, just practically, the way one warns a child about the weather. You are not the kind of girl who gets rescued, Eleanor. You must be practical. You must be useful. You must find a way. Eleanor had decided at age 14 that she would find her own way. Thank you. She had spent 12 years since then doing exactly that. She was only at this particular ball because her friend Cecily had begged her. Just 1 hour, Cecily had said. Stand near the refreshments. Talk to no one interesting, and then we can leave, and I'll buy you that book you've been wanting. Eleanor had been standing near the refreshments for 43 minutes when a man appeared at her elbow and said, very quietly, "Miss Voss, I wonder if you'd do me the very great honor of marrying me this evening." She turned and looked at the Duke of Blackwell. Then she looked around to see who he was actually talking to. There was no one behind her. "I beg your pardon," she said. "It's a long story," he said, "and we have about 12 minutes. But I want you to know, before you decide, that I intend to be very honest with you about all of it." Eleanor Voss had read enough law to know when a sentence was doing a great deal of work. "Start talking," she said. James Calloway, the 6th Duke of Blackwell, had not intended to be at this ball either. He was 31 years old, broadly considered the most formidable peer in London, and privately considered by everyone who actually knew him to be operating at about 60% capacity on any given day, due to a persistent and comprehensive exhaustion with the entire structure of his life. He was the product of a title he'd inherited at 19, a fortune large enough to make genuine friendship nearly impossible, and a father who had taught him by example that emotion was a structural weakness. He was not unkind. He was careful to be precise about this in his own mind, but he had learned to keep the distance between himself and other people at a width that felt manageable. He had never been in love. He had long suspected this was less a personal failing than a reasonable response to the available options. Every woman presented to him in society had been presented like a portfolio, assets listed, liabilities minimized, the actual person somewhere behind the performance of the person. He found it exhausting. The bet had been Ashby's idea, offered in the particular spirit of cruelty that passes for wit among men who have everything and value nothing. It had been directed at James specifically because James had said too precisely and once too often that he would never marry for society's reasons. "Prove it," Ashby had said. "Marry the least eligible woman in that room. Marry someone society would call your punishment." James had looked at the woman by the ferns. He'd noticed her 40 minutes ago, actually. She was the only person in the room who looked like she was somewhere else, reading, thinking, cataloging, something. Her face was quiet in the way that meant occupied, not empty. He had spent 11 years in a world full of empty. "Done," he'd said, and now he had 11 minutes. "So," Eleanor said when he finished explaining, "you want to marry me to win a bet?" "Yes," he said. "That is the mechanism. But I want to be clear." "You want to be clear," she repeated. "At 11:49, with a vicar. Standing by." "He's waiting in the East Corridor," James confirmed. Ashby thought he was being very clever arranging that part. He didn't consider that I might actually go through with it. Eleanor looked at him with the expression of a woman who has encountered many varieties of human behavior and is filing this one under new category. "What do I get out of this?" she asked. He blinked. It was clearly not the question he'd expected. The duchy, the title. "I have no particular interest in a title," she said. "I have a great deal of interest in my independence. My mother's house has a roof that needs replacing and a mortgage that will become untenable within 18 months. My own income is sufficient for my needs, but not for emergencies. I have a research project I've been trying to complete for 3 years that requires access to a private library I cannot currently obtain." She met his eyes. "You have a private library." He stared at her. "Ashby's estate," he added slowly. 200 acres. You'd have them. Do with them what you like." "I'd like to establish an agricultural school," she said, "for women from tenant families." Another silence. James Calloway, Duke of Blackwell, looked at the woman in front of him, the ink stain on her right hand, the completely unhurried expression, the list of conditions delivered at midnight, with the calm of someone who had been prepared for something like this without knowing it. Something shifted in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. "We have 7 minutes," he said. "Then stop talking," said Eleanor, "and take me to the vicar." The vicar looked profoundly uncertain about the whole situation. Eleanor signed her name clearly and without hesitation. James signed beside her. 2 witnesses were found, a bewildered footman and Cecily, who appeared from nowhere, read the room in about 4 seconds, and took the pen with the expression of someone storing up a story she would tell for the rest of her life. At 11:58, it was done. The ink was still wet on the register when Ashby burst through the door. He looked at James. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the register. His face went through 4 distinct colors. "You're joking," he said. "I am reliably not," James said. He offered Eleanor his arm. She took it with the precise and unsentimental grip of someone who had decided to commit to a thing and was committing. "I believe you owe me a country estate." They walked out together into the London night. Behind them, Ashby stood in the east corridor of the Pemberton ballroom, holding a cocktail napkin with a bet written on it, and said absolutely nothing. The carriage ride to Blackwell House was quiet. They sat across from each other in the dark, the city moving past the windows. And Eleanor was aware of the precise strangeness of the situation in the way that very intelligent people are aware of strangeness. Clearly, without panic, with a great deal of interest. "I should tell you," James said, "that I intend to honor whatever arrangement suits you. You may have the East Wing entirely, your research, your library access, the Ashby estate for whatever purposes you named. I won't," he paused, choosing words. "I won't intrude." Eleanor looked at him in the dark. "How long have you been offering people the version of yourself that won't intrude?" she asked. He said nothing. "That was impertinent," she said. "I apologize." "No," he said. "It wasn't." He looked out the window. "Since 19, I think." She thought about that. "The title," she said. "Yes. You've been performing the Duke for 12 years and you're tired of it." Another silence, longer. "You're very direct," he said. "I'm told it's my most problematic quality." "I find it remarkable," he said. And he said it the way people say things they haven't planned. Briefly, honestly, before the careful version catches up. Eleanor filed that away. She looked at her ink-stained hand. "I won't ask you to be anything other than what you are," she said quietly. "I'd appreciate the same courtesy." "Agreed," he said. The carriage rolled on through the London dark. Neither of them said anything else. But the silence was different from how it had started. Blackwell House was enormous and impeccably maintained and felt, in the way that only truly large houses feel, profoundly unlived in. Eleanor was shown to the Duchess's suite by a housekeeper named Mrs. Pont, who had the impressive composure of a woman who had served this household for 22 years and was not going to let one unexpected midnight duchess disturb it. She was given a tour, offered tea, and left with the assurance that breakfast would be at 8 if she wished it. Eleanor stood in the middle of the Duchess's suite, all pale blue silk and impractical furniture, and a dressing table with a mirror large enough to feel accusatory, and thought calmly, "What have I done?" Not with panic. She wasn't a panicking sort. But the question settled in the room with her as she changed out of her evening dress and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. She had married a man she'd known for 9 minutes, a man who had married her to win a bet. A man who had nonetheless looked genuinely startled when she'd named her conditions, and not startled in an insulted way. Startled in the way of someone encountering something unexpected in a place they'd long stopped expecting things. She thought about the way he'd said remarkable. She thought about the ink on her hand. She thought, with the part of her that had been reading legal documents since she was 17, This is either the most catastrophic mistake of my life, or it is the beginning of something I don't have a framework for yet. She decided to find out which. Morning arrived with the information that every newspaper in London had the story. Eleanor was not surprised. She was sitting in the library. She had found the library at 6:30, because of course she had, when James appeared in the doorway with a stack of papers and the expression of a man who has resigned himself to something. 11 mentions across 5 papers, he said. Yours. She held out her hand. He passed them over. She read them with the rapid focus of someone used to processing text for information rather than entertainment. The Duke's midnight madness. His Grace the Duke of Blackwell, long considered the most determinedly bachelor peer of his generation, has apparently taken leave of his senses along with, we are told, his standards. They're not very kind, she observed. They never are to women in these situations. She looked up. He was watching her with something careful in his expression, not pity, not apology, something more like readiness, like he was prepared to be angry on her behalf if she needed him to be. I have been called plain for 26 years, Eleanor said. It has never once stopped me from doing anything. She set the papers down. Though I notice they haven't called you mad. They've called you eccentric. The same behavior in a duke and in a woman, and the language is entirely different. Yes, he said. I know. She looked at him. You've thought about this, she said. The difference. I've had 12 years to think about a great many things I couldn't change, he said. He crossed the room and stood looking at the shelves. The third section from the left is natural philosophy. The correspondence collection is in the annex through that door. He glanced at her. I assumed you'd want to know. Eleanor stood up from her chair. She walked to the annex door. She opened it. The room beyond was floor-to-ceiling shelves, a writing desk in the center, 3 windows facing the garden, and approximately 4 decades of correspondence in organized boxes that she could already see included names she had only ever read about in other people's footnotes. She turned around. James was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, and there was something on his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the architecture of one, like the smile had been there so long ago that only the shape of it remained. This, Eleanor said, may be the finest room I have ever been inside. The ghost smile became briefly real. Good, he said. It's yours. The first week of the marriage was, from the outside, unremarkable. Eleanor worked in the library annex for 6 hours a day. James managed the duchy from his study. They ate dinner together, which had apparently not been standard practice in this house for years, given the faint surprise of the kitchen staff when the order was placed for 2. They talked at dinner. At first, it was careful, territorial, almost, each of them feeling out the borders of the other. But Eleanor Voss had never in her life been able to resist an interesting argument, and James Calloway, it turned out, was the first person in 12 years who didn't agree with him on everything and wasn't afraid to say so. By the 3rd night, they were arguing about agricultural reform so intensely that Mrs. Pont had quietly removed the soup course twice because neither of them had touched it. By the 5th night, James had started bringing documents to dinner. By the 7th night, Eleanor had started bringing books. They were working on opposite ends of the table with the candles burned low, and Eleanor looked up from her correspondence and found him reading something she'd left on his side accidentally. One of her Edinburgh letters, the natural philosophy ones, and he was reading it with an expression she recognized because she'd felt it herself, the expression of encountering a mind that surprises you. He looked up. This is yours, he said. Yes, you wrote this. I did. He looked back at the letter. He called you the most interesting correspondent he'd had in a decade. He didn't know I was a woman for 3 years, she said. James set the letter down. He looked at her across the length of the table in the candlelight with an expression that was doing a great deal that she didn't entirely know what to do with. His loss, he said, for not asking. The candles burned. Eleanor looked down at her page. She was smiling and she was quite certain he could see it, and she found surprisingly that she didn't mind. The trouble arrived in the form of Lady Priscilla Hartwell. She came to Blackwell House on the 9th day, announced, at 2 in the afternoon, and she was the kind of beautiful that walks into rooms as a statement, pale and deliberate and arranged like a portrait of a woman rather than the woman herself. She had been, Eleanor learned from Cecily in a rapid letter, expected by most of society to be the Duchess of Blackwell someday. Expected for about 4 years, actually. Not because James had said anything. He never had, but because Lady Priscilla had campaigned for it with the patient confidence of someone who considered the outcome settled. Eleanor received her in the drawing room. Lady Priscilla sat down, accepted tea, and looked at Eleanor the way a surveyor looks at disputed land. "I'll be direct," she said. "Please," said Eleanor. "He married you on a bet. Everyone knows it. This marriage will be dissolved within the year. It can be managed quietly. These things always can, and then the proper order of things will resume." She smiled. It was a practiced smile, expensive and empty. "I'm not saying this to be unkind. I'm saying it because someone should tell you the truth before you become attached." Eleanor looked at her. She thought about 26 years of being the practical one, the invisible one, the one nobody worried about becoming attached. "That's interesting," Eleanor said. "Can I tell you what I've noticed about the proper order of things?" Lady Priscilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "I suppose. The proper order of things has been, in my observation, largely designed to keep women like you decorative and women like me invisible. It's very orderly. It's also completely useless." Eleanor set down her teacup. "James married me on a bet, yes, but he also told me the truth before he asked me. He showed me the library. He brings documents to dinner and argues with me about policy until Mrs. Pont gives up on the soup. She met those cool, pale eyes. That's not a man who wants a portrait on the wall. That's a man who's been hungry for 12 years and has finally sat down at a table." The silence was very long. Lady Priscilla set down her own teacup. She stood. She left without the parting remark she had clearly prepared. Eleanor sat alone in the drawing room for a moment. Then she picked up her teacup and drank the rest of it, calm as anything. That evening, James came to find her in the library. She could tell by the way he moved that he'd heard about the visit. The house had ears. All houses this size did. And Mrs. Pont, despite her composure, had clearly reported the afternoon's events with some editorial additions. "Priscilla came," he said. "She did. Are you?" "I'm perfectly well." Eleanor looked up from her book. "Though I do want to ask you something, and I'd prefer you answer honestly." He sat down in the chair across from her. His usual chair now, she noticed. He had a usual chair now. "All right. Did you ever intend to marry her?" A pause. "No," he said. "I knew what people assumed. I never corrected it because—" He stopped. "Because correcting it would require a conversation about what you actually wanted," she said, "and you weren't sure you knew." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to identify as "how do you do that?" "I've been watching people use silence as a container for things they're afraid of for a long time," she said, not unkindly. "It's an extremely common strategy. What do you do instead?" "I write things down," she said. "It's harder to be vague on paper." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name and not her title. She noticed. She noticed immediately. "What do you want from this? Actually, not the library, not the estate. What do you want from this?" The fire crackled. She looked at him honestly. "I want it to be real," she said. "I came in on a bet and a practical arrangement, and I am aware that this was not designed to become something. But I am not very good at pretending things are less than they are." She held his gaze. "I think you're one of the most interesting people I've ever been in a room with. I think you've been waiting for someone to talk to you instead of at you for a very long time. I think you are considerably less frightening than your reputation suggests. And I think your reputation is something you've been hiding behind for so long you've started believing it yourself." She paused. "And I think you already know what you want. You're just not used to the idea that you're allowed to have it." James Calloway, Duke of Blackwell, looked at this woman, ink on her hand, book in her lap, telling him the truth with the steady patience of someone who had been telling truths into empty rooms her whole life and had simply decided to keep going. "I want to know how it ends," he said. "How what ends?" "You," he looked at her. "I want to know what you think about things I haven't thought to ask you yet. I want to know what your research concludes. I want to argue with you at dinner until Mrs. Pont gives up entirely on the second course." His jaw tightened slightly. He stopped, started again. "I want you to stop expecting me to treat you like a temporary arrangement, because I'm not going to." Eleanor was very still. "James," she said. "I know I came in on a bet," he said. "I know this is 11 days old. I know none of this is how it's supposed." "Stop," she said. He stopped. She got up from her chair. She crossed the library in 6 steps, and she kissed him, not timidly, not tentatively, but with the full conviction of a woman who had decided to stop being invisible and had found, to her considerable interest, that being seen was not the catastrophe she'd been taught to fear. He kissed her back, and then he laughed, a real one, startled, the kind that comes from somewhere that doesn't get used much, and put his forehead against hers in the firelight of a room full of books and years of kept careful distance, and said, "I want you to know I don't actually care about the estate." "I know," she said. "I do, though. The agricultural school." He laughed again. She felt it against her cheek. The transformation of Blackwell House was not dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no overture. It happened the way real things happen, incrementally, then all at once, in ways no newspaper could quite capture in a headline. Eleanor's books spread from the annex to the library proper, then to James's study in the form of one carefully placed volume she thought he'd want to read, and then a second one, and then, one afternoon, she simply sat in the second chair in his study and worked while he worked, and neither of them remarked on it. He started introducing her at events differently, not correcting. He never actually needed to correct, because Eleanor was fully capable of introducing herself. But the way he stood near her shifted. He had always maintained in every social setting a particular careful distance from everyone around him. He stopped maintaining it with her. Lords noticed. They noticed at the Morley dinner, where Eleanor spent 40 minutes making Lord Bryce look extremely underprepared on the question of the Corn Laws in front of his own peers, and James sat beside her with an expression so transparently, utterly proud that 3 people at the table had to look away. They noticed at the Pembridge Gallery opening, where a well-meaning countess asked Eleanor, with the particular sympathy of the deeply condescending, how she was adjusting, and Eleanor said, "Magnificently, thank you," with such complete sincerity that the countess couldn't find the foothold for pity she'd been looking for. They noticed at Ashby's club dinner, yes, Ashby, who had arranged a dinner ostensibly for other reasons but transparently in the hopes of observing his bet's consequences, where James and Eleanor arrived together and left together and in between, had a conversation in the corner that made them both laugh twice, low and private, and the whole room felt the exclusion of it like a change in weather. Ashby found James by the door at the end of the evening. "Well," Ashby said. He had the grace to sound, if not humble, at least diminished. "Well," James agreed. "I didn't think." "No," James said. "You didn't." He looked across the room to where Eleanor was finishing a conversation with one of the quieter young lords, who was nodding with the expression of someone who has just been given a great deal to think about. "That's the difference between us, Ashby. I stopped at her because she was the only person in that room who wasn't performing anything." He paused. "Turns out those are extremely rare." Ashby looked at Eleanor. He looked at James. He looked at the napkin he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since that night, a habit, a trophy, and he put it in the ashtray and walked away. The agricultural school took 14 months to establish. Eleanor spent most of those 14 months in furious and productive correspondence, in meetings that politely terrorized various local landowners into cooperation, and in occasional partnership with James, who turned out to have both a talent for quiet negotiation and an absolute refusal to let anyone disrespect his wife in the room while he was in it, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the precise and immovable force of a man who has decided something and will not be moved. She noticed the first time he did it. A meeting with a neighboring earl who had referred to Eleanor's proposal as charming for a woman's idea, and James had said, quietly and without heat, "I'd engage with the substance rather than the speaker, if you have objections. I find the substance sound," and moved on. Later, alone, Eleanor had said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about growing up invisible, about the careful, practical survival of someone who had been told she was not the kind of girl who gets rescued, so she'd learn not to need it. She hadn't needed it. But this was different. This was not rescue. This was someone standing next to her because they decided to stand next to her, because she was the most interesting person in the room, because she argued about the Corn Laws and had ink on her hand and had kissed him in the library with complete conviction and meant every bit of it. She found this to be considerably more than she'd known how to want. In the spring of the second year, on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon, Eleanor came to find James in his study and found him reading one of her letters. Not the Edinburgh ones, new ones. Her own writing, the early drafts of her research, the ones she'd been hesitant to show anyone because they were still unformed and she didn't like being unformed in public. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "I found these in the annex," he said. "I should have asked." He held them out. "Do you want them back?" She crossed the room. She sat on the arm of his chair and took the papers from him and said, "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the argument in the third section is the strongest thing I've read in 5 years. I think the conclusion is understated because you're still doing the thing where you make yourself smaller than the work." He paused. "And I think you should publish it." Eleanor looked at the pages. "People will argue with it," she said. "I know. You'll enjoy that enormously." She laughed. He caught her hand, the ink-stained one, and held it without comment. the way he'd started doing. This man who had spent 12 years performing carefully maintained distance, who had married her on a bet and found at the end of it that the distance had gone somewhere, and he didn't want to bring it back. James, she said. I think this is the part where I'm supposed to tell you that I love you. She looked at him. I've been composing the sentence for about 3 weeks, and it keeps coming out too small for the thing. He was quiet for a long moment. Tell me anyway, he said. I'll know what you mean. She looked at his face, the lines of it, the occasional laugh in it now, the guards still there, but worn thinner, worn honest, worn into something she recognized as the shape of a real person. I love you, she said. Simple, insufficient, true. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the ink stain on the side of it, the permanent one, the one that was just part of her, and said against it quietly, I have been so catastrophically in love with you since approximately the 4th dinner. The Corn Laws argument, she said. The Corn Laws argument, he confirmed. She laughed. She leaned into him. Outside the study window, Spring was doing exactly what Spring does, relentlessly, generously, without asking permission. The agricultural school opened on a Tuesday in May, on what had been the Ashby estate and was now, formally and legally, the Voss Blackwell Institute for Rural Education. Eleanor's name was on the gate. Her name was on the gate first before his, because it had been her idea, and he simply written the checks and the letters and shown up to every meeting and called anyone who made difficulties by their full title in a tone that produced immediate cooperation. She had asked him once why he'd put her name first. Because it's yours, he'd said, as if that settled it. It did. The opening was well attended. The newspapers, the same ones that had called her plain and called the marriage madness and called James's choice a punishment, sent correspondence. Several of them wrote things that were almost, if not quite, apologies. Cecily was there, eating a small cake with the expression of someone who has been right about something important and is taking private satisfaction in it. Lord Ashby was not there. He had not been at much lately. Rumor had it he was in the countryside somewhere, reconsidering things. Eleanor had no strong feelings about this, either way. James stood beside her at the gate as the first students came through. Young women from the tenant farms, 12 of them, nervous and practical, and so carefully dressed that Eleanor felt the back of her throat tighten. And he said nothing. He just stood beside her, his hand finding hers the way it did now. She squeezed it. This is real, he said. It is. You did this. We did this. He looked at her. The real smile, the deep one, the one that had taken months to fully arrive, the one that was just his now and not a performance of his, was so present on his face that 3 passers-by noticed, and one of them, an older woman with excellent taste and observation, touched her companion's arm and said quietly, That is a man who knows exactly what he has. Later in the evening, when the reception had wound down and the last students had gone, and they were alone in the old Ashby drawing room that was now an education office, Eleanor sat on a windowsill and looked out at the grounds that had been 200 acres of bet winnings, and were now something entirely different. James sat on the floor below her, because that was how they read, that was how they worked, that was the particular domestic geometry they'd somehow arrived at without planning. His back against the wall, a glass of wine balanced on his knee, looking up at her. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. She looked out the window. She thought about a woman by the ferns at a ball who had been practicing invisibility for 26 years. She thought about 9 minutes and a midnight vicar and a cocktail napkin bet. She thought about law books and Edinburgh letters and a library annex with windows facing a garden. She thought about corn laws and ink stains and a man who had learned, late but genuinely, that a closed-off life is just a very long and boring anteroom to the thing you actually wanted. I'm thinking, she said, that punishment is a very funny word for this. James tilted his head back against the wall. He looked up at her against the window light, this woman who had never once been invisible to anyone who bothered to look, who had walked into his life through the absolute accidental side door of a drunk lord's bet and had proceeded, with complete serenity, to dismantle 12 years of very carefully maintained nothing. The worst punishment I've ever had, he agreed. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Outside, the spring evening continued doing exactly what it was doing, lavish, indifferent, full. The Morning Chronicle, 3 days later, ran the following in its social column. The Duke of Blackwell was observed at the opening of the Voss Blackwell Institute on Tuesday last, in apparently excellent spirits. Those present have noted that His Grace, long considered the most determinedly remote of his peers, appeared, by multiple accounts, entirely happy. We are given to understand His Duchess is chiefly responsible. We further understand that Lord Ashby, whose informal wager began this union, has declined to comment. Several lords of our acquaintance have been heard to remark, with varying degrees of wistfulness, that some punishments are quite enviable. We confess we agree.